The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day. Wes, very nice to meet you.
Joe, pleasure.
So I, like many people, was introduced to you because of the debate you had with Billy Carson.
Quote unquote.
You know, it's one of those things where it's very unfortunate when people get caught with their pants down. And I'm not an expert in many things, but the things that I am an expert on, you could wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me about those things. And I go, oh, yeah, no. This is what it is.
Yeah.
I know, you know, like martial arts or comedy, I could tell you, I could give you an expert version of reality. It seems like he does not have that. And he is a wonderful talker, and it's a lot of fun. I like watching his videos. I love all that stuff, and even the most ridiculous tinfoil hat aspects of it. It's fun.
It's entertaining.
But I know that there's a different, like Andrew Schultz and I had a discussion about this. Like he said when we talked earlier on the podcast, he said, we're not going to fucking research anything. We're not going to search anything. We're not going to do anything. Just let him talk because it's fun.
Yeah.
Andrew's awesome. But when he was on with you, it was quite apparent that you are an actual expert in the Bible and in many religious texts, and that he didn't necessarily have the facts straight. So
Yeah.
what was the fallout of all of that?
Well, it's interesting you say the expert thing, because I literally was asked to do it 24 hours beforehand. So I had like the least amount of preparation going into it, and I was okay with it. Because I'd listened to Billy Carson. Well, and I listened to the stuff he'd said. So I knew enough about the ways that he'd articulated things about the ancient Near East and the Bible and Christianity to know enough that his level is pretty surface. But the fallout was that not only did he not want us to release the conversation, but then he started throwing out cease and desist letters, and then he started, trying to sue people. So, I mean, I was never worried because I'm a Canadian, and anybody who's tried to sue internationally knows that...
Good luck.
Yeah, right, yeah. As far as I understand it, he would have had to file a claim in a Canadian court that would have been reviewed to have legal precedence. That he'd have to prove that he could win.
What was his argument?
Apart from the fact that he was embarrassed that he lost?
Well, yeah, that's not really an argument, right? We've all been there. You're hungover, thinking about all the dumb stuff you did last night, wondering if anybody remembers. Unfortunately, someone does remember. Internet Parker just even lawyer that just up or extra months
cease and desist letters
completely free. Tap the banner to learn more.
Well, the cease and desist letter, yeah, the cease and desist letter said, I don't want you to use my name or my face in anything going forward, and anything you've used up until this point you need to remove. And I was given 24 hours notice to do this.
But if you're a public figure, he's clearly a public figure, is that even, can you actually say no? So what was does he have a lawyer that wrote this cease and desist? Is he a lawyer?
No. So he actually, it's interesting because Mark Menard, who was the guy who hosted this interaction, he sent Mark a handwritten one. And then he eventually gave Mark an official one from his lawyer. So I actually was sent one by his lawyer, which I, screenshotted, posted publicly online, and said I'm going to ignore this. But he'd sent Mark, who was the podcast host, as far as I'm aware, numerous cease and desists, and Anton, who was the media manager. He'd sent a number of cease and desists.
It's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate.
When you get caught with your pants down, you're supposed to say, I got caught with my pants down. Yeah. That's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. It's the only thing, especially in the public. It's very clear and correct.
Well, the irony of this situation is if he just kind of left it probably wouldn't have made anywhere close to the splash that it's made. And we told him that. We said, like, hey, Barbra Streisand effect is going to happen.
Yeah.
Like, you're a big enough personality that if I make a video and say, like, hey, I had this conversation, didn't go well for Billy, and Billy doesn't want it released, that's going to start to gain traction sooner or later.
Yeah. It's, the problem is to really delve into these subjects. It takes a tremendous amount of research, years and years and years of research. You really have to know what you're talking about. Most of us don't.
Well, and especially with languages.
Yes.
Like, we didn't get into it. I hoped to have, in our initial conversation, kind of press him a little bit more on the more overt things he'd said about, like, Greek and Hebrew and Sumerian. Because I've studied a number of ancient languages, and when you study the languages, you realize the complexities of these things. And so when someone hasn't, and they're making statements that are obviously indicative of someone who hasn't studied them, it's super.
Right.
And so I think it's one thing to be making claims about, say, like Christian history or the Bible, but when you start to get into like linguistics and philology, it gets messy. And if you don't know what you're talking about, it gets really apparent really fast.
So the gentleman who brought the two of you together, what was his goal? Like, what was he trying to do? How did he approach you?
Yeah, so he's friends, or I should say was friends. He was friends with Billy. They live in the same neighborhood.
Oh, boy.
So it's actually become really, it's become pretty rough for him. So he released a video yesterday, which I think people should go and check out, where he kind of gives his perspective. He's been friends with Billy for years. He was at Billy's wedding. Oof. Billy had 15 people at his wedding.
Oof.
Mark was one of them. And they live in this community in Florida. Their sons are friends.
This
wives
might be
would
the
hang
video
out.
that gets me canceled from
And,
Christian YouTube, but I want to give some quick
Mark
thoughts about the Joe
told me,
Rogan
he's
Wes
like,
Huff
I've been hearing Billy
podcast,
say,
because
you know,
I
he
have
wants
seen
to
so
debate,
many
nobody will
people
debate him
talk
for
about
years.
this for the last week or
And
so.
so as
And
far as I think
now
Mark
that
was
the
concerned,
podcast
he
is
was
out,
giving
and I
Billy
did
the
watch
opportunity
it,
that Billy
everyone's
had
saying that it's the
told
greatest thing
a lot
ever,
of people he
and
wanted.
how amazing it was
And so
for
he,
Wes Huff,
this
a
was
Christian
set up,
apologist, to give the gospel
in that
to Joe
Mark and Billy have
Rogan
been talking,
on this podcast
they've been on
for
each other's
millions of people
podcasts in the past,
to be able to potentially
and they've been
hear
friends.
it. The problem with that
more like business
is
colleagues.
that
Like
it's
Mark
not
has come out and
true.
said,
the gospel
I hadn't
wasn't
really gone
shared
into
in that
the
podcast.
stuff he'd said about Christianity
Now there were a lot
or ancient religions or whatever that much. Mark is he's a Christian. He has like a public profession of faith, and him and Billy had talked about the fact that they wanted to talk about like faith stuff and some of their differences, and that Mark was kind of prepping for this, and his media manager Anton had sent him some of my stuff and said, like, Wes has done some stuff on some things that Billy has talked about, and you know, maybe you should look up some of this stuff, you know, read into it. And Mark, very last minute, was like, well, I feel inadequate. Do you think I could just ask Wes? And so he DM'd me on Instagram and just kind of laid this out, like, hey, I'm going to have Billy in my studio in 24 hours. I can tell him you're coming, I can tell him who you are, I can like give him your background, but would you be willing to come? And so that's what I did. And so that's how it got started.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but was Billy aware that this was going to be a debate, or did he think it was going to be just a discussion? Like, what did he think it was going to be?
No, he'd been given all of the prerequisites. Like, he knew we're going to go over some of his stuff that he'd said about Christianity, that I was going to come in, who I was, what my name was, some of my background, and that part of the conversation was going to be me kind of asking him some clarifying questions and rebutting some of the things that he said. So you didn't watch the 3-hour live stream?
I watched chunks of it.
Okay.
I watched a little bit and I'm like, oof, and then I shut it off, then I watched a little bit more, oof.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Billy there says he had no idea going in. And I mean, as Mark said in his video that he released yesterday, I mean, that's patently false. He knew what it was going to be, who was going to be involved, and even some of the things that we would be talking about.
Okay. And he also was claiming that it wasn't a debate, that he had been involved in debates before, and that he would prepare for debates, but this is something he didn't. But again, it's like, if you ask me about things that I know about, you can wake me up out of a full sleep and give me a couple seconds. This is what it is.
Yeah.
If you know, you know.
And it wasn't a debate in one sense. Like, it wasn't. Like, we didn't do, you know, opening statements and cross-examination and rebuttal. It really was a conversation. And it only kind of turned into a debate in the sense that Billy, I think, got caught out. And so the things that were talked about kind of showed that he needed to go on the offense.
Yeah. Well, again, it's all very unfortunate. But the good part of it is I was introduced to you in your work. And
there you go.
Very, very extensive and very fascinating. And the videos that you sent me on Instagram, I watched both closely. Awesome. So really, really interesting stuff. And your knowledge of the history of the biblical texts and the Codex Sinaiticus and all these different things. Very, very fascinating stuff. So let's just get into your background. Like, how did you get started in your research, and how did you get into this?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were missionaries. So I was born in Pakistan and spent a portion of my childhood in the Middle East, with my parents working in Amman, Jordan. And then we came back from the Middle East when I was pretty young. And so I grew up in this very diverse home, in the sense that my mom was a missionary kid who grew up in India. And so we had a lot of worldview kind of perspectives represented in our home. Like I often say, we had the Bhagavad Gita and the Book of Mormon and the Quran on the shelf.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think, that always, although my parents were never overt with this kind of stuff, they always had the perspective that, we're Christians. We believe that this worldview perspective is true, but hey, this stuff isn't scary. This stuff isn't, off limits. We can investigate these things. And they never said that outright, but that I always felt this kind of attitude of that kind of perspective. And, having been exposed in majority Muslim contexts and seeing that kind of stuff, and my mom having a pretty good knowledge growing up in India of things like Hinduism and Sikhism and that. I don't know how much of the kind of testimony stuff you watched of mine, but just before my 12th birthday, I actually was diagnosed with a neurological condition that left me paralyzed from the waist down.
I did see all that.
Yeah, so that's a condition that's called acute transverse myelitis, which I often say is a word you can forget as soon as you hear it, because it's a complicated one. But what happened was that I had the flu, and my body's immune system attacked the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord and caused swelling and cut off the communication between my brain and my legs.
We've done good today.
And
Instantaneously, right?
yeah, basically. I'd gone down for a nap. I was camping out in the bathroom floor for flu reasons. And when I woke up, about 30 minutes later, I couldn't feel my legs. And so, yeah, that's the acute part of the acute transverse myelitis, was that it was basically instantaneous. And that's what made the diagnosis as severe as it was. Like they said, there's a 30% chance. It was like a small percentage of probability that I would recover, but a much higher percentage that there would be a lot of either complete paralysis for the rest of my life, or some kind of issues with walking. It's related to diseases like multiple sclerosis, in that it's neurological and it affects that kind of thing. And 1 month from the day that I woke up and couldn't feel my legs, I woke up on a Saturday morning, got out of bed, walked over to my wheelchair and sat down.
1 month.
1 month, yeah. January 8th to February 8th, exactly.
Very fortunate.
You're telling me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What treatment did they give you?
So initially they gave me steroids to reduce the swelling, but so I spent 11 days in the hospital being overseen by pediatric neurologists and specialists in this, because it's a very rare condition. And so they were studying me, and they gave me steroids, and they did some other tests, but really there was no true kind of treatment in that. So I was doing physiotherapy. I would be pulled out of gym class in school, but it was a little bit of a joke. Can you move your legs?
Along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Laos.
Could you move anything?
No, nothing.
Could you feel anything?
No.
In the face of superior
No, in fact,
forces.
when I was in the hospital, I'd wake up and there'd be pinpricks in my legs, because they'd be testing where the reactions were, and they'd have used a syringe. So I'd wake up and just tiny pinpricks in my legs, because they'd been testing while I was asleep to see what whether it was registered neurologically. But I couldn't feel anything. I was fully impaired. Yeah, but going back to that, so I experienced what I consider to be a true supernatural experience, in that I walked into the hospital to the doctors that had overseen me, and they were the first ones that used the word miracle. They said, "You really don't have any type of medical explanation." And mainly because there was no atrophy. Because of the cutoff of the communication, my muscles in those 30 days were fine. And it's a short amount of time, but they said there should be something, and we're picking up nothing.
That's crazy. Because I've broken limbs before and had them in casts, and just in the 6 weeks that you have a cast on, you have massive atrophy.
Yeah. So that was the kind of predication for them using the word miracle. And so that's kind of, it marks this, what I do consider to be like this supernatural, something happened. But
did you feel like that was like a calling that like led you to a very specific mindset after that?
It's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, as much as you could at 12 years old.
Right. But it must have had a significant impact on your psyche and your perceptions.
Yeah, well, it definitely led to things like later in life I got very involved in athletics, in track and field. And part of that was feeling a conviction that I knew what it was like to not be able to wake up and walk out of the room.
Right.
And so taking that pretty seriously and competing competitively well into university. Because even though, I wasn't the most naturally talented individual on the team, I felt like a motivation to be able to, I don't want to waste this. Right. And then later on, in terms of your original question, the difference in that was that I realized, there's something out there, something happened that I can't totally explain on naturalistic terms. But how do we go from that to saying, well, then this worldview is correct? And so despite, being raised in a Christian home, I felt like my parents telling me what was true is not the worst reason to believe it, but it's also not the best. And so as a teenager, I did a lot of kind of soul searching. And like I said, I was able to do that to a certain level of degree because of the openness within my household, where I pulled the Quran off the shelf and I read it, front to back, just trying to figure out, what's going on here? What's all this about?
Right.
And it was through that period of like searching, and it wasn't a crisis of faith. That would be an over-exaggerated term. But it was kind of
an inspiration of faith, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. Digging through, what do these guys believe?
Right.
What is this perspective?
Right.
And that was about a period of about a year and a half. And at the end of that, I did truly feel that, I think in the ways that my limited ability as a teenager to investigate these things, I think that Christianity is true. But it wasn't until I went to university where I was engaging with people of other faith perspectives in Toronto at York University, where I was talking to Muslims and Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses and atheists, from the gamut. Mm-hmm. And I was having these conversations, and I was expressing kind of my perspective on what I believed. And they would say things like, well, that sounds great, Wes, but, that's all the Bible. You can't trust that. And so that's where I started to take
Did Mormons say that to you?
Well, yes.
That's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Well, in the sense that,
the Mormon was the craziest one.
Yeah.
Because we know who wrote it.
Yeah.
And he's a shady dude.
He is a shady dude. Well, no, they did in the sense that the Book of Mormon trumps the Bible. So they would believe, I think it's the 10th article of the Mormon Church, is that they believe the Bible insofar as it is translated. And so they have this perspective that there's been things that have been affected. I mean, Joseph Smith made his own translation of the Bible, and it's rough.
And when he was 14.
Well, I think it was later on that he made the Joseph Smith translation. But
really?
I don't even know if the official LDS Church ascribes to the Joseph Smith translation, because I think they even see this is, we know what the Greek and the Hebrew looks like, and this is not even. Yeah.
Well, he was, legitimate con man. Yeah, which is fascinating. That people have such a deep search for meaning and truth that if you are confident, and which is what a con man is, confidence man. If you are really good at expressing yourself and really, like, you show confidence in your convictions, you can persuade a lot of people.
Yeah, confidence is not competency.
Yes.
And unfortunately, those things get confused a lot. Like,
well, it covers up for competency sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In religion and politics and like all sorts of things, right?
In everything.
Yeah.
In everything. I mean, I think because people want to, like, it's very difficult to be an expert in a subject. And I think people want to believe that they are, and they don't want to do the work.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's why, experts themselves feel a lot of inadequacy, is because they study a subject and realize, like, I'm never going to get to the bottom of this hole.
Right.
So, unfortunately,
most subjects are very, very nuanced and very deep.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you're talking about ancient religion.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about things that were a oral tradition for a long time before they're even written down. So it's a long trudge to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah. And part of the whole, like, what I was trying to get Billy in that conversation that I had with him to get to the bottom of, partly was a question of methodology. Like, I think he got frustrated at me at one point because I kept asking, what are the criteria that you're using when you're looking at one source versus another source and coming up with a conclusion? Because in historiography, it's the inference to the best explanation. And so there are different ways that you go about that, different methodologies. And historians very rarely disagree on the data and the evidence. It's the conclusions that you draw from that. Right. But then there are some things that are just out and out false. And I don't think Billy totally knew what I was talking about, but it's those criteria that we look at when we look at something that does come from like an oral tradition and eventually gets written down and becomes a literary text. And then you analyze that on the basis of it being a literary text.
This is sort of the problem between with being self-taught rather than conventionally academically trained.
Definitely.
Where you're trained in very specific disciplines and you're taught to understand the foundation before you understand like how to put a window in.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that you have to know from the base, from the beginning. Like, do you have a water line? Do you have power? Like, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things going on when you're trying to construct an expertise in something, especially something that is so complicated. And one of the things that I've gotten out of I've probably watched probably 20 hours of your stuff over the last couple of weeks. And you've spent a lot of time on this. This is not a casual, cursory examination of these texts and of religion. This is a long journey, and that's what's particularly exceptional and really interesting to me, because I'm always fascinated by people that have really gone down the road, like really gone down the road, because you don't meet a whole lot of them. I know a lot of Christians that can quote you some versions of the New Testament, some Psalms, but the real, the go all the way to the back, way, and that's what you've done. That's very interesting. So this is like, how old are you?
I'm 33,
which is very young for someone who has the depth of knowledge that you have. So you've been doing this essentially from that miraculous moment. That ignited this spark, even though you came from a missionary background, and then from then on. So for the past 11 years, 12 years, or 20 years, 30 years, like it's your whole life essentially. It's all been this.
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, I went to university with full intention of going into the police force. I did my undergraduate studies, and I kind of mapped out this plan that I was going to become a police detective, and that was my goal. And I think I realized...
Why that? Because you like getting to the bottom of things?
It could be.
Because you do. Right?
Yeah, well...
When someone spent 21 years like, getting to the bottom of religion, you're probably pretty good at cracking.
I hope so. I think that might have been part of it. I also there was an aspect of when I was in high school where they were like, you got to figure out what you're doing, or you're going to be homeless and you're going to die.
Yeah,
like,
I remember that part.
I felt that like
it was
the
terrifying
pressure.
moment in life.
Man, I always tell people when they're in high school, like, you can chill out. Like, it's going to be okay.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? I wonder if it's different now
I
because
think you should have a certain amount of desperation. Because I think that it ignites the fire within you to do something.
there's probably something to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The people that I know that have been too pampered and taken care of and didn't have a fear of everything going completely sideways, they never really get the momentum that's necessary to accomplish things in life.
Yeah, there's probably something to that. I mean, desperation.
A little desperation fear, I think, is good for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody wants to be comfortable. I don't think that's necessarily a good path. I mean, I think you should have perspective and you should enjoy your life as a young person and have those moments. But you should also realize you got work to do.
Well, and stress is good, right? Stress creates perseverance and creates patterns that allow you to succeed.
Yes.
I mean, this is like Athletics 101, right?
I think that's very important.
You got to push yourself. And I think actually part of that also led in, like, I'm a big believer in athletic discipline needs to go hand in hand. I mean, I know you are too. Needs to go hand in hand with any other type of, like, whether it's an intellectual endeavor or like, because it trains you to be able to go into places that are uncomfortable.
Yes.
And that uncomfortability allows you to then become stronger. You know, realize where your inadequacies are. And especially when you're with people who are better than you. I mean, when I was running at York University, there were two guys on our team who, because I was okay individually, but I ran for the relay team. Yes, I was a sprinter. And one of the guys was part of the they medaled when Canada medaled at Worlds. He was part of that relay team. And then my other training partner, Busy, who he ended up competing in Tokyo for Canada. And when you're beside someone who is like just a genetic freak, you're like, oh, okay. Like, that's different.
Yeah.
Right? And it both pushes you, but it also reveals your limitations. Where that doesn't inhibit you, like you shouldn't, that shouldn't discourage you to go up to that line of being able to push yourself. But at the exact same time, it creates a real that, like, I can train as much as I want to. I'm not going to run like that, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, but going back to what you were asking, like, I think there was part of that in wanting to go into the police force, but then realizing, like, around my third year of university, that my passions and motivations were very, very different, and that I didn't know how to go about that or where the proper place to do that was, but I knew that I needed to lean into that to some degree, particularly with the Bible. 'Cause I was claiming that this Bible talks about this guy Jesus, and I'm a Christian. So I have a friend, Andy Bannister. He's out in the UK, and he says if you take Christ out of Christian, all you're left with is Ian. And Ian's a great guy. He's not going to save you from your sins. And so, like, if I'm wrong about the Bible, those people who push back on me, right, those skeptics of various worldviews, if the things they were saying about the Bible were true, then it did actually legitimately undermine what I believed. And so I needed to take that seriously. I had an obligation to actually investigate those things as far as I could.
Playoffs. We're talking about playoffs? You bet we are.
One
Or of the
Stories in the Bible. Is it the Dead Sea Scrolls or are there older versions?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest of the Old Testament. So when they were discovered, I mean, so they were discovered in 1946 to 1957. And at that point, during their discovery, they pushed back a lot of our previous oldest manuscripts 1,000 years, which was a big deal.
How old are they?
They're anywhere between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC. So it's kind of tricky because the Dead Sea Scrolls they're like a library that we refer to. So it's approximately 970 documents, but it's distributed out between 10,000 and 11,000 fragments. So there's a lot going on there, right? So, and some of these, I mean, are so fragmentary that you look at them and it's like confetti. Because they're, I mean, 3,000 years old, but not quite that. They're like 2,000 plus years old. Right?
Animal skins too, right?
Yeah, well, all sorts of things. Animal skins, papyri, and then some of them are actually done on copper.
Really?
They're like inscribed in copper.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one of the coolest ones. Actually, this relates because I know you're a Marco Allegro guy. The first time I was introduced to Marco Allegro was not his Sacred Mushroom and the Cross stuff, but he published a book on what's called the Copper Scroll, because part of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments is this inscribed document on copper, which is an ancient treasure map.
Can you see it? Is it
Yeah.
online?
Yeah, Jamie, pull up the... Hey!
There it is. Wow.
Yeah. So it's in Hebrew, and it is wild. So it has these sites where it says buried treasure is found.
Whoa.
And there have been a number of guys who have tried to like look for it. And so...
Does it say what the treasure is?
You know what? Off the top of my head, I don't know. But...
Look how crazy that language is.
I know, right? And so... But the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it's like stuff like this. It's papyri, it's animal skins, and it's a number of different languages. So the vast majority of it is in Hebrew, but there's also a lot in Aramaic, and then Greek and in Nabatean. So it's like an umbrella term to just describe a whole bunch of literature. So a lot of it is biblical because it was written by this group out in the desert called the Essenes who lived at Qumran. So. But then other stuff of it is just, it's just Jewish literature of various stripes that were hidden in caves all around the Dead Sea.
So the scrolls, as it were, aren't all biblical. Some of them is just the counting of the times.
Yeah. Oh, Jamie, look at that. 65 tons of gold and 26 tons of silver.
65 tons.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. How many Cuban links can you make out of that?
You can see why someone would try to track that down.
Boy.
Yeah.
Wow.
And when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, like you have ones like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is fully complete. Like it's a copy of the Book of Isaiah, and it's a full complete scroll. But then other ones are so fragmentary that we think they're written in Hebrew, but we can't actually tell.
Oh wow.
Because no one's willing to like piece these, and this is true for a lot of stuff. So the largest grouping of papyri literature in the world is the Oxyrhynchus collection, which we get a good portion of our oldest manuscripts of the New Testament from. But if you go to Oxford and you look at the Oxyrhynchus collection, and you pull out that drawer, it's like a jigsaw puzzle.
Right.
Like most of it is untranslated, untranscribed, because the amount of man hours that it would just take to even put it together, never mind then go to the effort of transcribing and translating it. And most people are not willing to do that.
And if you're missing chunks, how do you even make that puzzle connect?
Well, that's part of my area of speciality and research is in regards to that. So I study paratextual features. We're really going to get nerdy today.
Let's get nerdy.
Where you look at the features of the manuscripts, not necessarily the words, but things like the spaces between the words, the development of punctuation, indentation or outdentation, and I look at the margins, and I try to, based on the average size of manuscripts in and around that time, and also the average spacing of words and the margins on top, bottom, and the side, recreate what the manuscript could have possibly looked like.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So when you say the Book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the Book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word. Wow. Yeah. So this is the Great Isaiah Scroll. So if you go to Israel and you go...
Is that papyrus?
Yes. No, I think that one is vellum.
What is vellum?
So I should be more specific. So parchment is animal skin. Vellum can be used synonymously with the term parchment. Technically, parchment is like baby animal skin, like calves or lambs. But this is the Great Isaiah Scroll, and you can see like they stitch together the parchment because it's so long.
God, it's so beautiful. The way they wrote back then was so beautiful. I mean, maybe it's because I can't read it, but it's so fat. Maybe if I saw English, I would think that's beautiful too.
Yeah.
Especially script, like if cursive is very beautiful. But that is so fascinating because obviously coming from a point of ignorance, the letters look so similar. Like so many. This is what I always got about cuneiform. When I look at that, I'm like, it's just one particular sort of character that's this way and that way and up and down and
Cuneiform is wild.
Weird.
It's really, really tricky. And that's the thing when, like, if you're studying ancient languages and you start to study Greek, like, the Greek alphabet is similar enough that you're like, okay, alpha looks like an A, right? Delta looks like a D. So you can figure it out. And so it tricks you because you start off and you're like, oh, this is phobios, fear. I know what a phobia is. And you get this false sense of encouragement. And then, the further you go down the rabbit hole, you're like, oh, I'm screwed. So, but Hebrew is completely the opposite because the writing system is so different. The learning curve is hard at the beginning. And then you're like, everything is just 3 letters with a suffix added to it. And so it feels like, whereas the opposite is true with Greek. Greek, you're like, I get this. And then when you really go down the rabbit hole, you're like, oh crap, none of the things that I learned about that are supposed to be standard, all of them have exceptions. But cuneiform's a wild one.
Do you know who Rick Strassman is?
No.
He's a scholar, and he did a lot of early work, FDA-approved work on psychedelics. And he spent 16 years teaching himself to read ancient Hebrew.
Nice.
Yeah, so because he wanted to really understand the Bible from the original source of ancient Hebrew and to understand it in context. Because ancient Hebrew, the way the words are structured, is so different than English, and that's something.
A lot of great things that happened. I was actually pretty impressed with Huff and his ability to articulate some of the nuances of textual criticism, a very difficult topic to give to the layperson and not have it be super confusing. And I think he did an excellent job. He's a teacher, so it makes sense that he would be able to explain this in very simple terms, even though it's very complex and confusing. So I thought that was all pretty great and a good thing for a Christian to be able to do, to be able to give someone a resource of why we can trust the Bible. That's great. But what I'm hearing people say is that the gospel was shared and that millions of people heard that gospel and now can make a decision for Christ. And like I said, the problem with that is that it just isn't true. There wasn't a gospel presentation in this podcast, and I find that deeply troubling. There was a lot of conversation about winning a debate and crushing someone in a debate and the background about that debate, because that's the viral moment that this Huff guy had, is that he crushed this guy and now he's on this podcast talking about that. And he did a great job of articulating it in a humble way and not coming across as being like, I demolished this person because I'm so much more, superior than him. My intellect is so much more, none of that. I didn't get that from him, even though I think Rogan actually tried a few times to kind of point him in that direction. He didn't take the bait. So I appreciate that. But there was a lot of conversation about that, a lot of conversation about textual criticism. A lot of great things that happened. I was actually pretty impressed.
Thing must be lost in translation. So he spent 16 years teaching himself how to read ancient Hebrew. That is that is such dedication. 16 years.
It's a long time. That seems too long.
Well, you're self-taught. I mean, he's doing it himself.
Yeah. Self-teaching. Yeah. I self-taught myself Greek at first, and then when I started learning it formally, I realized how much you miss when you self-teach yourself.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, how many people can teach you ancient Hebrew? How many courses are available?
Oh, you can take it at any graduate college.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And is it, it's not something that we know what it sounded like, correct?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big debate with ancient languages.
Right.
Like, same thing with, arguably, we don't know how any of this was pronounced.
Right.
I mean, modern Greek speakers get really mad at me when I say that, because they're like, of course we know how it's pronounced. It's pronounced like we pronounce it, right? And on all my videos where I'm like site translating Greek manuscripts, there's so many comments of modern Greek speakers getting mad at how I'm pronouncing things. But realistically, we don't really know how most things are pronounced with anything.
But isn't that very bizarre when you're translating? Like if you go back to, like, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh, we don't even know what the words sounded like.
Yeah.
We kind of know what they represent, and then we do a literal translation of what they represent. But if you've never heard, no one can speak ancient Sumerian.
Yeah. Well, Sumerian's a wild one because it's a language isolate.
What does that mean?
So Hebrew is an Afro-Semitic language. So Hebrew is related to all of these other languages like Aramaic and Akkadian, but language isolates have no adjacent comparisons.
Whoa.
So, because I tried to teach myself Sumerian and I failed and I just gave up because I couldn't do it because I had nothing to really compare it to.
Right.
So Sumeriologists are very they're a field of their own because I learned a little bit of Akkadian because I had studied Semitic languages, and there's enough crossover between things like Hebrew and Aramaic and Akkadian, but Sumerian you have nothing to compare it to. And
what did it eventually become?
It just died.
It just died.
It just died.
How? Do you know?
I mean, the Sumerians lost to the Assyrians, and the Assyrians got taken over by the Babylonians. I mean, it's just the course of history where things happen. But there are a number of ancient languages that are language isolates, like Linear Elamite. We had no idea what Linear Elamite even said until 2021.
Well, I never even heard it until 5 seconds ago.
I know, there you go. Jamie, if you pull up, if you look up, what's it called? There's a cup, a silver cup. It'll come up if you Google image Linear Elamite, because you think cuneiform looks wild. Linear Elamite is completely different than that too. And there's a silver cup, which we had no idea what it said, and then a bunch of researchers, ancient Near Eastern researchers, developed what. So let's in the corner there, that one on
Far left corner?
Oh no, here, now it's moved because you clicked it. That one, yeah, click that. So that's Linear Elamite. And so that's in and around the same time that languages like Sumerian. So there's this very interesting kind of, if we're talking about the story in the Bible like the Tower of Babel, where it says that God confused their languages and everybody started speaking different languages, you have these languages that just pop up and out of nowhere and have no relation to one another. So Akkadian starts to adopt certain words in Sumerian, but they're still Sumerian words. It's like pizza is Italian, right? Or like kayak is Inuit. But when you're looking at the words that carry over, it's not because there's a relationship between Akkadian and Sumerian. It's because you have these cultures that live side by side, and eventually Akkadian starts to adopt these things. But Sumerian is, so that's why when I see people like Billy Carson talk about being able to read Sumerian, I'm like, dude, I read ancient languages and I can't. I've tried and I can't make heads or tails of Sumerian.
Yeah.
So
that's a tell.
Unfortunately, it kind of gives away.
Listen, I like Billy. He's a nice guy. I really enjoy talking to him. I really do. I think his videos are fun. But I also think truth is important.
I have no problem with him as an individual.
He just needs to course correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, course correct and recognize what you know and what you don't know. And that you're not doing people a service, especially people like myself that aren't educated in this. Like we turn to others who claim to have a vast knowledge of this to help me out. Tell me what's going on. When I sit down and talk to you, tell me what's going on. And if you don't really know, you're fucking over a lot of people, unfortunately,
Yeah.
for yourself.
Yeah.
This how do you say it again?
Linear
Elamite. Can you put that back up again, Jamie? So this was in 20. Can you show me that image that you showed me before?
Actually, see if you can find the cup.
That's pretty dope, right
If
there.
you scroll, there should be a cup. I think it's called the dashed.
Is that it in the lower corner?
No,
That's not the cup.
No, if you guys, it's got. Yeah, if you look up cup. Yeah, that guy. So see that inscription at the top beside the face?
Yeah.
So that's the one. So it goes around the top of the cup, and they crack that.
Look at that dude's
He
honker.
said there's a large
got a
tunnel
big
complex
nose,
right
isn't it?
That's
below
a hell
us.
of a nose.
Yeah, he can smell that linear elamite. And so actually, interestingly enough, if you pull back, Jamie, that's my.
Score some good intel
So there's
down
an infographic that I
Shep,
made
maybe
that
you
just
should get
popped
down
up.
there and
So if you
snoop
click
around.
that guy,
there?
Put in
that's
a
the
call
one
to
I
6 and tell them
made.
to have an extraction ready.
Why is it coming up like that?
Tôi không vào đó đâu.
Okay.
So is it just bad resolution? Is that what you're saying? Oh, there it is.
Oh no, this is mine.
That's
So
yours. Okay.
so actually, here I'll be self-serving. If you go to wesleyhuff.com,
That is. So, can we just look at that for a second? That is so cool. And how old is this?
20th century BC.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 4,000 plus years ago.
Yeah. So if you go, Jamie, to wesleyhuff.com and then click my infographics tab at the top. So I started making these things for the graduate students I was teaching. And so if you go down, there should be an archaeology section. And in the archaeology section, I have that one on, I don't know what it's called. I make ones for manuscripts too.
What a great website you've got.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate
This is
that.
awesome. It's so deep.
Yeah, so there's a linear elamite one.
What a fucking phenomenal resource this is.
Right there.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, Marv Dash. That's what it's called. So yeah, you see this. So I have Sumerian, Linear, Elamite, Akkadian, and Paleo-Hebrew there at the bottom, the comparisons. And these are languages that operated like alongside one another, but are almost completely foreign to one another. So there is crossover between Akkadian and Paleo-Hebrew.
So that's interesting. Sumerian, when I'm thinking of cuneiform, I'm not thinking of that, right? That looks different than some of like the clay scrolls, where they've the imprintations that they make with a clay wheel.
Yeah, well, it's all done with the stylus. So it's like a little wedge stylus. So there are different variations of it, but ultimately it's done with the stylus. The thing that's interesting, like you're probably thinking more of what that later Akkadian looks like, right? Where it's like the wedges.
Yeah.
So Akkadian basically borrowed the writing system. And it had development over time, but is very close.
So when they conquered them, did they have their own writing system initially and just incorporated Sumerian writing to theirs?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one. But
God, I'd like to know.
I know, right?
I mean, it's so long ago, but not,
Yeah.
I mean, it's so long ago in terms of the human.
Yeah.
But it's not that long when you think, like, we went from 4,000 years ago to that to large language models.
Yeah, that's
And,
pretty crazy.
Yeah, quantum computing.
Yeah. Well, even if you look at language systems develop. Paleo-Hebrew turns into what we saw in the Dead Sea Scrolls, whereas Paleo-Hebrew is a little bit different than what we eventually see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there's like a development within the language. And then modern Hebrew adopts the Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but modern Hebrew has vowels that were developed in the Middle Ages to figure out how to pronounce it. Because basically, ancient Hebrew doesn't have a vowel system in its writing that's overly comprehensive. And so in the Middle Ages, when you have these groups of Jews who are copying these Hebrew scriptures, who aren't speaking it as much as they're reading it, you got to figure out how to pronounce it, because vowels make a difference. But if you took all the vowels out of English, if you were a natural English reader, you could probably figure out what was what if you're looking at the page. And so in the Middle Ages, the Masoretic scribes come up with these vowel pointing systems, and that's what you see when you look at a Hebrew Bible today, is you see these vowels. And sometimes the introduction or removal of the vowel is significant in the changing of the words.
It's also interesting, and we're kind of seeing language change, written language, while right now in this current era because of we've kind of abandoned cursive.
Yeah.
Right? So if people in the future go to read ancient scripts of human beings that lived in the 20th century, they'll be like, what is this shit?
Yeah.
And then, if there wasn't a lot of it, like there's no cursive on the internet. I mean, there's cursive on the internet, but I mean, no websites are written in cursive, or very
it's all
few
printed.
at least. It's all printed.
Yeah.
And so they've essentially in school stopped teaching. Most classes don't teach cursive. Like we all learned cursive as children. It was the way you could write things quicker.
Yeah.
And then once printing and typewriters and computers became ubiquitous, like it's gone.
Yeah.
And everybody's just texting.
Yeah. Well, let's
know?
hope people in the future are still able to read the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Like, 'cause that's what it was written in, right? Stuff like
yeah,
that.
that's really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because if you were not taught that, and then you went to read that and you said, this is English, you're like, what are you talking about? Like, I recognize a few of these letters, but it's so vastly different than the printed text.
Yeah. Language models are wild.
Wild.
Yeah.
The whole thing is wild that people figured out how to associate sounds with little symbols, and then they did completely different shit in Korea, with completely different shit in Russia.
Yeah.
Like it's so fascinating. And then you have to have these experts who can translate these things, and you're dependent upon them forever, which that was what Lutheranism was all about, right? Like Martin Luther wanted to have phonetic translations of the Bible, and there was a lot of resistance to that because the people that knew how to read Latin were like, hey, slow down.
Yeah. Partly, I mean, there were proto-reformers before Luther.
Were there
guys
really?
like Wycliffe. So John Wycliffe and William Tyndale both translated the Bible, parts of the Bible into English, and they predated. I mean, and they weren't very popular for it either. I mean, Wycliffe was declared a heretic, and then his body was exhumed and burned because of the work that he did. But yeah,
Burned him after he was already dead.
yeah. Well, Tyndale's line was that he wanted, I believe it was Tyndale. It was either Wycliffe or Tyndale. My friends who are specialists in this are going to get mad at me for this. But one of those two guys said that they wanted the plowboy to be able to read the Bible and know it as well as the priests. And so that was their motivation, is that they're like, public education for literacy in these areas was largely because they just wanted people to read the Bible. But that was a big motivation behind Luther, was he's like, I'm going to translate this thing to German. Because part of his kind of kicking off of what we call the Protestant Reformation was that he read the Bible in Greek, because there was a guy named Desiderius Erasmus who was they called them humanists, but it means something different than now. Humanists were like scholars who were trying to figure out the entirety of human knowledge up until that point.
Whoa. Like
Renaissance men, kind of, right? So Desiderius Erasmus is like one of the last true Renaissance men. But he was compiling, and he produced the first printed edition of the Greek New Testament. And so he comes out with this printed edition of the Greek New Testament, and Luther gets his hands on it. And so he's reading that, and he notices that in Matthew's Gospel, the word that's in the Latin is penitentiam agite, do penance. In Greek is metanoite, which is repentance. And the church was using this as like, you need to do penance. You need to do all of this stuff to show that you're sorry. And part of that was, paying the church. And Luther reads this and he goes, hey, guys, this means something different. This means repentance. It means changing your mind. It doesn't mean like to actually do things. And so part of his motivation is like, the Latin isn't reflecting, at least at the point that Latin had developed in that day. Like maybe when Jerome translates the Latin Vulgate back in the 4th century, and it's called the Vulgate because Vulgata means like regular. Like you think of vulgar, right? It's just a regular people language. Part of the reason was that in the 4th century, very few people were reading Greek. They were reading Latin. And so they're like, hey, Jerome, you need to produce a Bible in Latin because nobody can read the Bible anymore. And so he produces the Latin Vulgate. And ironically, by the time you get to Luther, 1,000 years later, no one can read Latin. And they're all using the Vulgate.
Wow, that is fascinating. Wow.
And even Erasmus was, so he dedicates his first few editions to the Pope, because he knows that the Pope is going to get wind that he's producing Greek New Testaments, and the church is using the Latin, and he's risking. So if he dedicates it to the Pope, maybe the Pope will take it easy on him.
Did it work?
Yeah, it did.
Nice. Little flattery.
Yeah. See, it goes a long way.
Well, that's part of the problem, right? Is that you're dealing with these priests, you're dealing with human beings. And when human beings are the sole purveyors of truth, that becomes a problem. It's power. It's too much power. Most people suck at power. They're just it just makes them drunk with it, and they abuse it. And you see that in many, many religions. You see that in cults. You know, for instance, is the best example of it, because like when you know the person who created this thing, and you know this person is fucking insane, and you have a bunch of people that follow them.
They're just looking out for your best interest, Joe.
Yeah.
Right? They just want to make sure you're doing the right thing.
Did you see Wild Wild Country?
Oh, yes.
It's fucking awesome.
Unfortunately.
It's so good.
Oh,
it's
man.
so crazy. I mean, I'm so glad I wasn't there and a part of it, but they all look good in the beginning. That's what's really wild. All these cult documentaries, all these exposés, in the beginning, like, these people haven't made. They're all eating together, and they have community, and they're praying together, and they seem
they're just seeking
wonderfully
enlightenment.
happy. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the ways my wife and I bond, we have very different tastes in movies, but there's enough crossover that our guilty pleasure is cult documentaries.
I love them.
They're so
I love
interesting.
them. I love them because there's something about people like absolutely believing things that's so appealing to me. I don't know why that is. Like, I like watching Islamic scholars speak, with like full confidence that their version of truth is truth. I'm just interested in that mindset. I think it's a very deeply cut groove in the human psyche that people can fall into. And when there's a cult, it's like, God, it's so obvious. Like, there's the guy. That's the guy. Like, here's a good example. There's a documentary called Holy Hell.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And you know that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I bought the building that Holy Hell was, like, the actual theater that this guy had built. It's a beautiful theater that he had his followers build so he can dance in front of them. That was going to be the Comedy Mothership, the first version of it.
That's crazy.
So I was under contract for that building, but it fell apart. Thank baby Jesus. Thank somebody. Thank Allah. Thank somebody. And then we found this new place on 6th Street. But that documentary is so fascinating because you can see this guy who is a gay porn star and a hypnotist take a bunch of really lost people and send them down this crazy road, and then eventually it all falls apart.
You know what's interesting about that is I have less of a problem with the objective truth claims and more of a problem with them saying, but don't look into it. Like, don't test it. Like, what I say goes, and you're not allowed to explore it. Like, talking about the Mormon Church, they recently did this thing where they're like, you don't need to go on the internet. You don't need to. And it's
Don't
like,
watch
guys,
the Book of Mormon.
yeah, guys, I don't think you realize what you're sounding like when you come across it.
Mormons are the nicest people. They're the nicest people. They really are so nice. I love them. I mean, Mormons that I've met have been so friendly. They're so family oriented.
It's true.
There's it's like really easy to like think these are great people. I'll join them.
You know why they're family oriented, right?
Why?
Is because in what Joseph Smith wrote, there's an idea that everybody's soul pre-exists, and you were born as a spirit child in a previous life. And the reason you need to have children is you need to bring those people's souls into existence. And so there's because you have a heavenly father and a heavenly mother, and we're all children of God in the actual physical sense, and that the pursuit is exaltation, where you will be a god on your own planet.
Right. Get your own planet.
Get your own planet. And this is so Joseph Smith in the King's Fall of Funeral Discourse. This is what he wrote. This is where he formulated this idea, where God, the Father, has a body as tangible as ours, the flesh and blood, and that he lived on another planet, and it was circles around the star, and that if you do everything right, you will also be the God on your own planet. And so you got to encourage people to have kids because you're pulling those spirit babies out of the spiritual realm. But you're right; they're incredibly nice people.
The nicest.
The nicest.
Yeah, it's a really great cult. I mean, or religion, whatever. I mean, I used to have a joke in my act that a cult is fake and it's made by one guy. That guy invented it in a religion.
Watch it! We need an immediate feedback. Over!
There might be something to that.
Yeah, and some for sure. But the question to me is always, what were they originally trying to do?
Right.
What was it based on? What in the beginning there was light? What is all of that?
Yeah.
What are those stories?
Yeah.
And when you take these stories and you are telling it for so long, that's why the book of Isaiah, what you're telling me, is so fascinating. That 1,000 years later, you have the exact translation of this at a time where most people were illiterate. Right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's only really been recently that we have the levels of literacy that we have today. I mean, this is part of the reason why you have these long spans of time between, like, when people live and then the ancient biographies that start to pop up about them, is because most people are just illiterate.
But imagine how crazy it is that something in a time where there's no printing press and something that had been passed on for so long as an oral tradition is exact word for word written you find in a cave in Qumran.
Yeah.
And then the same thing you get in the translation of the Bible. That's nuts.
Yeah. I mean, up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Testament manuscripts predated the Old Testament manuscripts by a long shot.
Really?
Yeah. Because the Christians were less discerning in their proliferation of written documents. So the Jews had this whole system where you had to be a trained scribe, and they were very, very careful with the procedures that you went through. Whereas the Christians were like, we want to get this thing out as fast as we can, as often as we can, which had a lot of benefits in that, like, their goal was a proselytization and evangelism, and that worked. But the downside of it was that you get really messy copies, where you have copies all over the place, but human error gets involved with, like, spelling differences and, additions, deletions, mostly for completely, like, understandable reasons. But we actually have manuscripts where we know the person copied it and they didn't know how to read it because they make mistakes that you wouldn't make if you knew how to copy. There's this really great example of a guy who copies, I believe it's the genealogy of Matthew. And he's looking at a manuscript that has 2 columns, and he's copying it from left to right, and he's copying it like this, whereas it's like the column you go down and then the next column. So in the genealogy of Jesus, he's got all the wrong people begetting all the wrong people. And you're like, you wouldn't do this if you know how to read, because God is in the middle of the genealogy. So, like, that kind of thing.
That is a real problem.
That is a real problem. But ironically, with the Christian manuscripts, because we have so many, it's actually because of the mistakes that we're able to trace the text back with a high degree of confidence. Because if you have copies that are floating around, North Africa and places like Egypt, and then you have copies in Syria, and you have copies out into Asia and into Europe and British Isles, when mistakes pop up, they're geographically located. And because you have so many, you can compare and contrast them and figure out, okay, well, this obviously happened here at this time, and you can pinpoint those things. So this is a field called textual criticism, where we do this with all ancient documents. Like, the Bible is a more kind of fleshed out field of textual criticism because we have so many manuscripts. But we do it with Marcus Aurelius. We even do it with Shakespeare with the different copies. Because if you only have one copy, you have to trust that the person who copied that got it.
Right.
Yeah. Which is the issue that we have for the Beowulf. We only have one copy of Beowulf. And so we don't know what it looked like prior to that. So we just kind of accept that, okay, this is Beowulf. Like, there's no way to compare and contrast the tradition of the manuscripts of Beowulf.
God, when you're saying this about taking copied versions of it and comparing errors and going back, and you're talking about so much time.
Yeah.
So much research.
It's legwork.
So much legwork.
Yeah. And fortunately, like, in the modern era, we get computers involved, and that cuts out a lot of just manpower.
I would like to see AI get to the bottom of that.
Well, there's an interesting, so in Germany, at the Center for the Study of New Testament Research in Münster, it's called CBGM, the Coherence-Based Genealogical Method. And it's tracing not manuscripts, but readings within manuscripts and finding the relationships between the different ones by like computer models. And so they are actually so this is actually the way that like modern era textual criticism is being done is with these language models that operate on tracing readings and how certain readings are related to one another, which has allowed us to do things like look at 4th century manuscripts and actually see that their readings come hundreds of years earlier in other manuscripts that we have in collections. So one of the clearest examples of this is there's a manuscript in the 4th century called Codex Vaticanus, because it happens to be in the Vatican right now. And there is a manuscript from the 2nd century which has the exact same scribal conventions that Codex Vaticanus does in particular readings. And so we know for a fact that the scribes who created Vaticanus did not have, I think it's P75, which is Papyrus 75. But they had some sort of collection of manuscripts that were similar. And so we can have confidence that the readings, although they're 4th century in particular areas of Codex Vaticanus, are actually 2nd century in their origination. And a large part of this is because of these like models that the computers got involved in.
Wow, that is so fascinating. Now, when they're going over things like ancient Sumerian and they're reading things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like if we can't say, we don't know how to make those words, we don't know what they sounded like, how are they translating it into an English version? Like when you, like, one of the things that's been compared quite a bit is the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah, the Great Flood. There seems to be some parallels.
Yeah.
Like, how close is it?
In some ways it's very close, and in other ways it's not. So that's the story of Utnapishtim, which is kind of a side story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh he realizes his immortality and is trying to find eternal life. And there's this guy Utnapishtim, who he runs into, who tells him the story of the gods gifted him with eternal life because he saved all the animals on the boat. And so there are actually parallels between that and, say, the Genesis 6 Noah Ark story. In, like, making a big boat, putting animals on it, and they get off, and then you sacrifice to, in this case, the gods, and the God. And I think what you're looking at there is probably a cultural remembrance of something that did take place. And so you have these adjacent cultures who they're existing within this framework of the ancient East, and you're seeing these kind of parallel echoes of things that actually did happen. So there are definite parallels, but I think sometimes people look at those and they overplay that. So one of the examples I often give is Advil and arsenic both have an ancient. But it's not the similarities that matter in that case, it's the differences. And so if you look at the differences, there are significant differences in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Utnapishtim story and the Genesis 6 story. If for no other reason than the Noah Ark story is a very small part of the book of Genesis. And the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is a little bit more stretched out. It has more to do with the theme of what Gilgamesh is doing in his epic. So, but there are obviously parallels between that because these are both ancient Near Eastern stories and they're products of their day. In the same way that I think you see parallels between some of the New Testament Gospels and other ancient Greco-Roman biography, in that, you know, these are products of ancient history, and so they're going to look like other ancient historical writings that kind of parallel around that. Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. It's just when you're talking about the oldest of old stories, it's always so interesting to wonder, like, when they're taking these oral traditions, like Socrates is famous for saying that he didn't believe you should write things.
Yeah,
right?
Make people lazy.
Right, make you lazy. You need to learn how to remember things. You need to exercise your memory. Which is so fascinating when you think that there must have been people that were in charge of memorizing these oral traditions.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about, particularly if you're talking about the Old Testament, the series of writings, like these are long stories that someone had to remember and pass on to generations. So the thing with me was always like, well, what was the origin of all this? Like, what was the first version of it, and where the hell did it come from, and what was it? What was going on where these people felt like in this time of incredibly difficult survival, right? You're essentially, you're hunter-gatherers, right? We're talking about thousands of years ago. And these people took great time and made great effort to preserve these stories. And then there's always human error, right? There's human error, as you were saying, with transcription and trying to decipher things and writing things down where you don't really speak the language. You got to wonder, like, how much did we lose in this oral tradition? Like, what was the original story? What were they trying to convey?
Yeah, and I think that there's an aspect of like a message that's trying to be communicated. I mean, we are modern people of the Enlightenment. So we almost have a perspective where we want something to be very like exhaustive, that ancient writers didn't have those same sort of conventions. Or so they're going to capitalize on certain ideas and concepts for the purpose of, when someone tells you a story, you don't memorize everything. You go to university, write notes, right? The people who are writing everything the professor is saying word for word, probably not the people who are going to remember what the professor says as well as the people who write down the main things. And when you write down the main things, the main points, without all of the other stuff that kind of is just, it's icing, then you get the main idea more. Ancient writers talk about this. So there's a guy named Quintilian who exists in the 1st century BC. And there's this series of writings that we call progymnasmata, which are basically like, how do you do good writing? So he's training people, maybe even individuals like Plutarch, who is one of the best-known ancient biographers, and saying, like, it's just as important what you don't say as to what you do say. Because you don't want to, A, writing in the ancient world is expensive, really expensive, and B, you want to make sure that your audience is actually getting the message that you want to convey. And so this is something that when you read like German scholars, biblical scholars of the 19th and 20th century, or even prior to that, like 18th, 19th century, they look at the Gospels and they're like, this isn't biography, because it's not capitalizing on Jesus' childhood. And we all know that good biographies tell about your childhood and psychologize and these sorts of things. Whereas if you look at some of these ancient writers who are talking about how you should write biography, they say, if there's nothing in their childhood that's that significant, don't write it. It's going to distract from, like, if there is something, say like Jesus' birth, or Luke tells a story when he's 12 of Jesus, when he goes with Mary and Joseph, and, you know, Mary and Joseph lose the Son of God, and they start going home without him, and they're like, where's Jesus? And they got to go back to Jerusalem. That's a significant story, and so it appears that Luke includes it because there's a significant reason to include that. But they wouldn't have had any problem with leaving out large portions of someone's life if it didn't contribute to what the ultimate goal of telling that person's life.
I think that's also what's important is we have to try, as difficult as it might be, to put our minds in the context of people who lived in a time where most people were illiterate, and you're telling these parables, you're telling these stories as an oral tradition, and that they have a different mindset in terms of the distribution of information and what the significance of these things are.
Yeah, these are documents, well, in terms of the Bible, like, as someone who identifies as a Christian, I would say that the Bible is written for you, but it wasn't written to you. It had a completely different original audience. But you should do your best at figuring out who it was written to and how that made a difference to them, because then the application is going to come out even clearer for you. And that should be ultimately, you know, the goal of everyone who's looking at ancient documents. Who was the original audience? How would they have understood it?
Yeah.
Because you can read all sorts of things because of your modern conventions into what someone is talking about in the ancient world and completely bypass what they're actually trying to convey in their intention.
Yeah, and again, it's almost impossible to put your mind completely into the context of these people that were living then. It's almost impossible to imagine the way they viewed the world, and the way they communicated. You know, and when you're dealing with like really old stuff like the Sumerian text, and then people have translations of it which can be fantastic, like the Zechariah Sitchin stuff. It's like you have to be a scholar in ancient Sumerian and understand the origins of language, and you have to, and then still there's massive debate. There's a whole website called sitchiniswrong.com.
Yeah.
But he's the most fun.
He's fun. I'm not convinced he could read Sumerian.
Really?
Yeah.
I think he was bullshitting.
I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt. He takes so many liberties with the stuff he's commenting on that I have a hard time getting my head around.
So if he couldn't read it, where would he be getting his translations?
From actual translation.
Okay, so he would take these translations and then make his own assumptions and his own interpretation. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree. I mean, even something like Nibiru is not a Sumerian word. It's an Akkadian word. But he makes a big deal about it being related to Sumerian. And it is a word that appears within Akkadian.
And Akkadian is what time period?
Akkadian is just after. So it exists kind of in a crossover where Sumerian predates Akkadian, but Akkadian develops alongside. And then, as cultures like the Assyrians come into power and kind of subvert the Sumerians.
So oldest Sumerian writing is what? What's the oldest timeline?
Like
5,000?
Yeah, around that. I think like 4 to 5,000 years ago.
Okay. And then Akkadian is when?
There's some overlap, but it develops into a language like just after, like the rise. And Akkadian develops into like it has stages, and then you have like Babylonian, Proto-Babylonian, Persian, Old Persian, Elamite.
We don't have. There's no writing at all with Göbekli Tepe, correct? It's all just iconography.
Yeah, or at least that we figured out that looks like writing. I'm really hoping to go to Göbekli.
What's your take on this whole reluctance to further excavate? There's such a small amount of the site. It's only 5% that's been uncovered. The LiDAR, there's a bunch more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an archaeologist. I have friends who are archaeologists, and I think archaeology is tricky because so much of archaeology is dependent on governments and institutions and funding that getting mad at archaeologists for not excavating is kind of like getting mad at construction workers for not fixing your potholes. Right. Where it's like, like they're kind of doing the last stage. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly incentive by the Turkish government to want to capitalize on that being a tourist destination. Mm-hmm. And you really need to safeguard archaeological excavations because otherwise it's being compromised,
right?
And like pillaging and stuff like that. It happens. I mean, when I was in Egypt 2 summers ago, and you go to the Valley of the Kings, they've got security cameras up everywhere because there are tombs there that we still haven't discovered. And so they're like, we don't want people digging around in here looking for...
Well, they've lost so much over the history.
Oh, we've only discovered 1% of ancient Egypt.
That's so nuts.
1%. Isn't that crazy?
That is the nuttiest part of all of history is Egypt to me. I still have not been.
You gotta go.
I know. I almost went in December. I just couldn't find the time. We're just too damn busy. I will, though. I definitely will. But it is, to me, the nuttiest time in history because good luck explaining the Great Pyramid. Good luck.
And it's such a big time frame. Like, there's 1,000 years between the pyramids being built and Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings.
Yeah.
1,000 years.
Yeah. Nuts.
It's so crazy. Egypt is one of the wildest places.
Well, it just doesn't make sense. It's like, how? What were you guys using? What were you doing? How'd you do it? How'd you measure it? How'd you figure it out?
Yeah. You've been to Greece, right?
Yes.
Have you been to Jordan?
No.
Oh, you got to go see Petra.
Yeah?
Petra's phenomenal.
Jordan Greece rather was fantastic.
They're all great.
God, it's just like when you're just there in the presence of these things and just trying to put your brain back for thousands of years and imagine what society was like back then.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Egypt was crazy because Egypt is like Greece in that you have like you can go to Africa and you see that kind of stuff, right? But you go to Egypt and there's 4,000-year-old paint. I can't get paint to stay on my wall for 10 years. Like, and it's almost exclusively because of the climate, and it got buried in sand. But it's so wild. So
when you say that 1% of ancient Egypt has been discovered, what do you really mean by that?
Of the percentage of what we know that happened in Egyptian history, 1% has been excavated in terms of what we can actually pull out of the ground and look at artifacts. So there's whole eras of pharaohs that we don't know where they're buried. Even when Tutankhamun was discovered, he was kind of a footnote in the pharaohs that we knew about at that time. And we didn't know he was, as extravagant, as rich, as, until we discovered his actual tomb. A lot of people at that time didn't even think he was worth looking into, because we have these lists of pharaohs, and the thing with the pharaohs is that the next pharaoh is always trying to prove that he's the better one. And this is why you go to Egypt and you find statues of Ramses everywhere. And part of it was because Ramses, I think it was Ramses II, he commissioned so many statues of himself. Because he's like, oh, I'm the best, I'm the greatest. And what they couldn't keep up with the commissioning, and they started actually rubbing off the names of previous pharaohs on statues and just putting Ramses on it. Because he was just, so you go like from the top of Egypt to the bottom of Egypt, and you're going to find statues of Ramses. You want to believe, and he did, right? Like, it worked.
We're talking about it now, 2024.
I know.
Yeah, that is nuts. So when you go there and you're in the presence of these things and you try to put yourself back into that time period, like, have you ever tried to think, like, what was the motivation to make something as great as the Pyramid of Giza, the Great Pyramid?
People definitely want to make their mark, right?
Oh, but that's a mark that just doesn't even make sense.
There's something to that. I mean, if you think you're a god,
right,
and you have this whole kind of worldview perspective and theology that you need to make something that and bear yourself with all this crap because that's going to make a difference in your afterlife, then you're going to go big rather than going home, right? So the perceptions of people in the ancient world are just so different. We got it so good right now. Like longevity, health, food is just on a completely different scale. And so the conventions of needing to make sure that, especially if you're like the richest guy around, that you tick off all the boxes, because you're going to die, and you're probably going to die sooner than you want to, sooner rather than later. And you have this whole perception of, well, if I bury myself with all this stuff and maybe even some of the people, we're just going to kill them and include them too, because they're going to help me out. That's going to help me after.
Being slaves,
Yeah, of course.
Why not? Yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Khufu's pyramid, what's the timeline that he was even in power?
I don't know. I'm not an Egyptologist or an archaeologist necessarily, but he was. I think that was like 4,000 years ago. We only really have a tiny little statue.
Because he's building a pyramid.
So they say, right?
So they say.
Billy thinks different, but
a lot of people think different. That's what's interesting about it is the archaeological argument that Dr. Robert Schoch makes about the water erosion in the Temple of the Sphinx.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating argument because it does appear like that's water erosion. and that would put the timeline way, way back.
Yeah, I think even just looking at the Sphinx, you can tell that no matter what your perspective is, you should entertain the idea, at minimum, that the head was later.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it doesn't fit the body.
It has much less erosion. But you could also attribute that to the different densities of the stone. Like, that's one of the things about these layers of limestone. It's like some of them are much more porous and some they erode easier.
Yeah.
You do see that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think they're doing a terrible disservice by covering the Sphinx with like new stones. And, you know, they redid the paws and all that. My God, people, like, leave it alone. Like, leave it the way it is.
Yeah, it's this tricky balance between
restoration and recreation.
Yeah.
Because they're in a recreation stage.
Yeah.
And it was obviously, they're doing it with smaller stones. And it like looks different. It's not the same thing. It's not what it initially was. It was carved from one piece of stone.
Have you seen some of the restoration stuff that Saddam Hussein did in Iraq?
No.
Jamie, you got to pull up the ziggurat at Ur.
Oh, no.
So Saddam Hussein was a bit of a nut job, but he believed, as this is as far as I understand it, that he was the recreation of Nebuchadnezzar. Oh. So he did all of this restorative work in Iraq on things like the walls of Babylon. And in Ur, he rebuilt the ziggurat. So if you look at that picture over there that says 1932 and 2022, that's what he did. Is he basically tried to rebuild this entire thing. And it's amazing. I am trying hard to get to Iraq because I wanna see this thing. Interestingly enough, yeah.
Don't die, dude. Don't die.
So that's actually Ur.
So I'm sorry, but so this is the modern version with the small bricks. The original version, was it all carved from one piece?
No, it would have been clay bricks.
So these were clay bricks. So what do we? Jamie, can you go back to the 1930 image, please, so we can see what it looked like? God, I would rather just have that. You know, I mean, I want to see what it looked like and what it looks like all these years later. I don't want to see recreation, which is very similar to what they've done with the Sphinx.
Yeah, the Sphinx. Even when I was in Egypt, they were doing some work in like.
Can you, Jamie? Can you go to the rehabilitation of the Sphinx or whatever they would call it?
Yeah, they put like the ruins of it.
Yeah. Well, the restoration part is the interesting part. Like, you can see the restoration. If you go to just Google restoration of the Sphinx paws.
Well, and they're talking about putting encasing stone up here.
Yeah, I've heard that too. God, don't do that.
I don't think they should do that.
No, you shouldn't do anything. I mean, obviously they took the original encasing stones off, but that's also history. So now you can see like the new paws. Well, that seems like the difference between buried and unburied. So like even when Napoleon came, like right there, like isn't that restored? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there was much more erosion. Napoleon came upon it was buried.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think that was the case.
Like over time, because you're dealing with these crazy sandstorms, over time everything gets kind of buried.
Oh, so much of it is under sand for so long. Like the temple of the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut was mostly under sand for a long time. Wow. Before they like uncovered it. Unfortunately, like the aridness of Egypt preserves things like crazy.
Yeah, so that's what the pause. That's a disaster. That's so gross. When if you do take that timeline, the Robert Schoch timeline, and you say, okay, so you're talking about thousands of years of rainfall, you have to go back to when there was rainfall in the Nile Valley, so now you're back like 9,000 years. One of the more interesting things about hieroglyphs and the interpretations of it is that the ancient hieroglyphs, the ancient versions of that, when they go back past the established dates of 2500 BC and before that, you get to like 30,000
Let's go! Let's move it!
And they say that these are myths. These are not, this is not representative of an actual history. This is some sort of mythical history.
Yeah, numbers are tricky in ancient languages because it's not entirely clear whether numbers are meant to be representational.
Is that like why they said that Noah lived 600 years old?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, you have that. You have the Sumerian king lists, which have people living hundreds and thousands of years too. And I mean, there are some interesting academic articles on like the probability of the numbers that come up in those, because we have a base 10 counting system because we count our fingers. Ancient Near Eastern cultures like the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, they had a base 12 counting system because they would count each hinge, or what do you call these, like spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
The different joints of the finger.
Yeah, the joints. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have 360 degrees in a circle, 365 days in a year. Like this comes from the Mesopotamian counting conventions. And you look at some of these lists and they're operational and all divisible by like 12 and 60. And you're like, what's going on here? So not all of them, but enough of them where it's statistically impossible. And I don't totally know what to make of those things, because you do have the genealogies, I believe it's Genesis chapter 4 and Genesis chapter 11, where they're all divisible by these types of numbers that were very common in the ancient Near East. They're not random. Whereas if we look at the genealogies later in like Chronicles and Kings of the ages of the Israelite kings, they're random. And so it's just like, what do we do with that?
Right.
Because numbers are also far more representational, which is why we see numbers like 12 and 40 and 7 come up in the Bible, but also other ancient Near Eastern literature. Like there's certain numbers in Egyptian society that also were seen as like perfect numbers, or like numbers that you wanted to incorporate. So,
what's the earliest interpretation of calendars? Like, what is the earliest where they did decide what a year was?
I have no idea.
Because you got to imagine, if you're, the average lifespan wasn't so good back then.
Yeah.
A lot of people got infected, died of war, famine, all these things. It would take quite a long time for people to figure out what a year was.
Right.
If you have we're going thousands and thousands of years ago. We have to establish, like, okay, a day is, let's put this stick in the ground. When the shadow is here, this is where we start.
Yeah.
When the shadow goes all the way around like that, okay, maybe we can like mark these off. Okay, now we've got a sundial.
And there are different timekeeping conventions depending on society. Like ancient Jews had a different timekeeping convention than ancient Romans. And so that's why you see, like in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about there being evening and there being morning, is because, well, Jews today, right? You start the Sabbath on sundown the day before, right? So that's why. It's because there's different cycles. And so we go on a 24-hour time system. But ancient Jews had a different convention of that. Ancient Romans had a different convention of that. Ancient, Mesopotamian cultures had their own kind of conventions about these things, and calendars were all over the place. When you get to the Julian calendar, and they're like, we gotta standardize this thing because everybody's operating on a different, the Julian calendar and then the Gregorian calendar. Ancient timekeeping is very inexact and very messy, and so you kind of got to take certain things with a grain of salt,
right?
In terms of that, but ancient calendars, I don't even know. I know that talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The group in Qumran, who were they were a sectarian group of Jews who believed that the Jews in Jerusalem had basically capitulated and were not holy enough. And part of their reasoning is that they believe they have a perfect calendar. And so they use a different calendar that doesn't have to do things like incorporate an extra month every certain number of years because, their thing is not perfect. And part of their reasoning as to why they're like the chosen is that they have a timekeeping system that they say is perfect.
Many cultures used a 13-month calendar, right? Like, what was the logic behind that? Does that work?
I don't know.
The idea was 13 months, 28 days each month, and you wouldn't have to have leap years and all that shit.
Yeah.
Archaeologists, okay, there it is. World oldest calendar, 12,000 years old.
Yeah, that's wild.
So it is on Göbekli Tepe. Oh, the ancient carvings of the sun, moon, and various constellations sits on a pillar. Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years old. Researchers believe that ancient people used a so-called lunisolar calendar to mark the changing of the seasons.
Right.
Interesting. So it was at least representative of the fact that we know when the days start getting shorter, it starts getting colder, and then and then it warms up again. The days start getting longer.
This is why solstices are so key in like most of human history. It's because you got to figure out like what's a marker point.
Right. Which is one of the things that's so fascinating about some of the constructions of the pyramid, where on the summer solstice, these pillars line up so perfectly that the light shines straight down these hallways and illuminates everything. It's like, how did you guys nail that?
Yeah, I mean, just because they're ancient doesn't mean they're stupid.
Well, they're just brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't just stupid. They were fucking brilliant. That's what's, we weren't just ancient. It's just so weird that people were so vastly more intelligent, at least in terms of their ability to build things, than anyone else anywhere around there. That's what's so weird about Egypt to me. It's like there's amazing pieces of, like, even ancient Greece is incredible, but I can kind of believe you did it. You know,
right?
When you deal with 2,300,000 stones in the Great Pyramid, and some of them 50 tons, 60 tons.
That's pretty crazy.
500 miles away. Like, what did you do? How the hell did you do it?
I mean, there have been a lot of things that have been lost. We still, as far as I'm aware, don't know how the Romans made their concrete. That Roman concrete is like this thing that survives. They were able to make domes out of it.
Well, you know about terra preta in the Amazon. You know about that?
No.
Oh, terra preta is their particular rich soil that is man-made soil.
Oh, yes, I did know. I do know about that.
Combination of charcoal and bacteria, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievably fertile in terms of your ability to grow food on it. And they made it, and we don't know how they did it.
Yeah.
And it's man-made stuff.
Yeah.
Which is so bananas. It's like a giant chunk of this stuff that is all over the Amazon was made by people specifically to encourage the growth of plants.
I mean, this is why history gets me so excited.
Oh, it's so amazing. And it's so interesting too. I was watching something on YouTube yesterday about Mayan culture and the Aztecs. I went on a deep dive when I started getting into getting ready for this. But when you think about how many people existed back then, and then Europeans come and everybody dies. Everybody dies of disease. And it's like, how many people died? Like millions? Millions of people died here? Millions of people died there? Like, holy shit. And you go through like the story of the collapse of the Mayan civilization, the collapse of the Aztec civilization, like the accounts that these priests had of visiting these Aztec markets and how incredible they were. These people from Rome who would come to visit the Mayans. They're like, this is unbelievable, or the Aztecs rather. Like, this is unbelievable how sophisticated they are. And then
gone.
Everybody's dead.
Dunzo.
You just gotta go, wow. How many times has this happened in history?
Yeah.
Where people have visited places and brought their cooties and killed off a giant swath of the population. And one of the things that they're discovering now in the Amazon, which is so fascinating, is through use of LiDAR. They're discovering, like, oh my God, this is like all populated.
Yeah.
This whole thing was populated.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
The ground penetrating radar stuff.
And the trees and all the rainforest is mostly from man-made agriculture.
Yeah, that's wild.
Nuts.
Wild.
And this is all recent
Yeah.
that they're figuring this out.
Yeah.
Which is also so fascinating about history, is that it is a constant and never-ending search.
Yeah.
And that even in today, with as much information as we have, you can pick up your phone and ask them, when was Nero born? It'll tell you, like, instantaneously. We still don't have answers to a lot of really fascinating questions, like the Olmecs or all these other civilizations, like who, where did they come from? Why do they look like this?
Yeah.
Why do they make these big stone heads, or Stonehenge? It's another one. Like, Jesus, what is this?
Yeah.
There's so many versions of that all over the world, and it just the search for our origins is one of the most human endeavors. One of the most, because to know that we are particularly unique. We're so different. We stand out from every other animal on this planet. And there's this crazy, wild war of biology where life is just eating life all around us. And we just got to some crazy place that far beyond any other creature that's on this planet.
Yeah.
And we did it in a bunch of different ways. We did it in a bunch of different ways all over the place with different scribbles and different icons and different gods and different things. And we're all wondering, like, which one, where did it start? What was the origin of all this? Like, what was the need to write these things down? What purpose did it serve to have these myths and legends and stories? Like, was it just to keep society together, or was it to retell a very important story that was a very unique thing that happened at the dawn of time?
And that's why you see, I mean, the literary comparison of ancient Near Eastern origin stories is like a really interesting thing to do. Because when you look at something like the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian creation story, and then you look at something like Genesis chapter 1, there are obvious crossovers with, like I said before, these ancient Near Eastern conventions. But then you can see that the author of Genesis is making these points that are actually rebutting something like the origin stories of the surrounding cultures that largely believe that matter is like eternal and the gods come out of the created